of Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday in Conversation, and today my guest is a new friend, Mary Cronk Farrell. Hi, Mary. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I think our connection was through Suzanne, right? And
Right.
she was really great to pass my name on to a couple of other people, and you were kind enough to say, "Okay, I'll check it out." Right? So here we've been doing this, and I think I mentioned to Suzanne that I'm finding um, with young adult literature, as long as I've been doing it, not enough people are thinking academically or sponsoring those of you who write nonfiction, both for younger kids, middle grades and up through young adult fiction. And that's your strong sweet spot is the nonfiction area. So tell us a little bit about who you are as a writer, as an introduction to people who don't know you, and definitely should, because now I know, and I'm thinking, why haven't I known about this author a little sooner?
Well, that's pretty much what I say about the women who I write about. Why didn't I know about these women sooner? I didn't really intend to write nonfiction. Although I had been a television and radio reporter for many years, I wanted to write fiction. And I did write some short stories for a collection and a young adult novel. And then I discovered the US military nurses who had been taken prisoner in the Philippines by the Japanese during World War II. And I could not believe that I had never heard of them before. And so their story, of course, their story had been told for the adult market, and I wanted girls to know about these women. And so I just had to write that story. And then once I published that book, I sort of
Well,
just
let's
kept
pause.
going.
That's one of the ones I've actually got here that, when I found you, I got this one, and pure grit, and what a great story you do highlighting this. So why don't we spend a little bit more time on this one before we talk some others? Because this is another great find. Like you say, we probably don't know enough about many of the soldiers in general who suffered because they were stationed in the Philippines at the beginning of the war. And then these nurses. So, what's the short take on these nurses as we send people to the library, right?
Yeah. Well, the nurses in both the Army and the Navy were stationed in the Philippines and throughout the 30s, or definitely the late 30s. And nobody had any idea, as we all know, that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a total shock and a total
Yeah.
surprise. I mean, some people in the government knew that this was a possibility and they had a plan, but when it actually happened, the plan didn't work. And
Yeah.
so there were 101 total nurses, military nurses there when the bombs fell. And the attack came just 9 hours after Pearl Harbor. So it was still a surprise to everyone in the Philippines. Most of the nurses were sleeping at
Yeah.
the time. And so these women who had never had any training even in combat nursing were suddenly running out, in overwhelmed with the number of wounded soldiers coming in
Yeah.
and learning on the job. And if that wasn't enough, uh, let's say a month later, they were retreating onto the Bataan Peninsula, which,
Yeah.
people our age have probably heard of Bataan and Corregidor
Yeah.
as the most horrendous experience that maybe American soldiers had endured to this time. But um, this these nurses experienced it firsthand. The combat hospitals, the jungle, the hospitals were set up in the jungles of Bataan and on the island of Corregidor. And the front line just kept getting closer and closer and closer until, of course, what happened was the United States and the Philippine army were forced to surrender to the Japanese. And that's when these nurses were taken prisoner. Although there were 10, 20, I forget the number, that did sail. There was one ship that was able to leave Manila Harbor with wounded soldiers, and before the Japanese took over everything. And so 20 of the nurses went on that ship. The rest, 80, 81, something like that, ended up being captured.
And they were prisoners of war every bit as much. And it's just a non-told story, right? It's just a vacuum of, and what they suffered plus what they provided is a story that we need to tell more frequently, right? I did a summer seminar through the National Endowment for the Humanities years ago that was about feminist histories that were lost. It was done by a woman named Elizabeth Israelson Perry, who was an academic at Vanderbilt, really good scholar. But she said, it's history for a reason. They always function on the men, and she says we need a herstory, and she said she did a history book for classroom high school level American history book, and her editors came to her and said, "We think you're mentioning Eleanor Roosevelt too many times." And she said, "Well, how many times did I mention her?" And they said, "Well, 3." And she said, 3? That's all? It's like, first woman in a cabinet, married to a president, influential in labor movements. And she says, "Maybe I have to go back and add a few more in, And she said, "Well, how many times did I mention her husband?" And they said, "Oh, about 32 times. And she says, "Well, thanks for the criticism, but we'll keep it where it is. If not, and she was like as a scholar, she was often trying to figure out, who are the side characters that have a lot to do with history that we don't know about. So Pure Grit is your first endeavor in doing these histories? Wow. So where do you go from that? Because this is a book, again, that people need to know about. And if you're interested in history, and I recommend, of course, I think young adult literature is great for adults too, right? If you need an introduction and don't want to read something really thick, look at young adult
Exactly.
nonfiction, right?
Exactly. Exactly. So that is a firm belief of mine in these books that I have written. I try to make them as succinct, but yet all the important details and events and photographs. So, who among us has time to read a thick history book? Adults are actually most of my readers. I wish more young adults were my readers, but my goal is to bring these women's stories into a form that is easily accessible to anyone. Even Pure Grit, there's pictures of airplanes in there and things like that young men or boys, I think, would be interested in. So that's what I want, is to make these stories accessible.
Yeah, that's great. So where did you turn after Pure Grit? What did you do next after that?
Well, I guess I do have to admit I had a nonfiction story sort of simmering. And that was about a woman who I just discovered on the internet, named Fanny Sullins. And she was a labor organizer in, St. Louis, West Virginia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I had read that she was shot to death on the picket line during a strike, and that no one was ever convicted. There was a trial. It was probably not the right people on trial, and they were acquitted And I was, I didn't know much about the labor hit. I mean, I did know about the labor movement, but I did not know how brutal it was. And
Yeah.
I thought Fanny Sellen's story was an incredibly horrible, awful thing that happened once. After, of course, I wrote the story, I realized Fanny's story wasn't all that unique in
Yeah.
terms of the labor movement of that time. There were many people killed and no justice was ever brought for them. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Was this associated primarily with coal mining and everything else is where that was, or was it a generic labor movement that she was involved with?
well, she got started. She was a seamstress in St. Louis. And
Mm,
so that's where she got started. She helped found the first women's, well, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the details. It's been a few years since I wrote
yeah,
this
yeah,
book.
yeah.
But anyway, she helped found a union at the clothing company she worked for in St. Louis. And she was so good at organizing that the companies got an injunction to ban her from the street in front of the factory. And if she went on that street, she was going to be arrested, which actually turned out to be great because what happened was the union sent her and another woman on a nationwide tour speaking about the plight of the garment workers in St. Louis and raising money. And she was so charismatic and so convincing that that the union eventually won that strike. It took 4 years, but they won. They got money from around the country. They got support. So after that, she was kind of a known name in
Yeah.
the labor circles, and the coal miners in West Virginia were in the middle of, well, they weren't on strike or anything because strikes were outlawed in
Yeah.
West Virginia. But they asked her to please come and help, and she went to West Virginia, and it was there that she eventually was arrested and jailed because she dared to get up and speak to talk about the labor union when it was illegal to speak in public about a labor union. So she went to jail for that.
Hmm.
And then when she was eventually pardoned and let out of jail, I think after 6 months, um, I think that maybe at that point is where World War I happened. And so union activity halted somewhere in there. Anyway,
Yeah.
next, then she went up to the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating that the labor movement was actually kind of growing pre-World War One because lots of immigrants were rallying together because they were trying to eat and realizing they were being marginalized just because they were immigrants, right? And then World War One, we sent some of those same immigrants back to fight, right? They were the ones available to fight. But that's so when you find these ideas like the nurses in the Philippines and Fanny working on the picket lines or trying to create picket lines in the first place, right? Um, how do you go about researching this? Are you a thread puller? You find the one thing and start pulling the thread and finding the next document and the next document? Because you're the ones I've read so far are really well documented. You do a very nice job of tracing sources and putting those kinds of things together. So how do you go about it, Mary? How do you make it work for you?
Well, I tend to first start with the people. And with Peer Grit, what really started my research was I discovered that two of the nurses had lived here in my home state of Washington.
Oh,
And there was only one nurse still alive when I was researching and writing this book. But both of the nurses in Washington State, I was able to contact their daughters. And so that was how I began. I began with the people, and I ended up talking to a number of the family members of the other nurses, and eventually met the one nurse that was still alive. But it was kind of after that that I went to the records to get
Yeah.
more of the specifics.
Yeah,
With
this personal stories, or did any of them have journals or things that they'd kept along the way, or were the families, did the families know about this as well?
Well, that was interesting that most of the most like the daughters, the people that I talked to, their mothers never spoke about this. So they often learned maybe later when they were teenagers, or they had few details. They didn't speak about it because, just like the veterans often don't speak about their
Yeah.
experiences, it's just too painful. And no one really, actually, after World War II, when there was all the victory parades and the nurses came back and they were heroines and all of that, that only lasted for a short time, because then there was kind of this, we don't want to hear about the war anymore. We
Yeah.
just don't want to hear about all that bad stuff. We want to move forward, and you go back to doing what you were doing before. So the stories were kind of quelched, but there were letters that the nurses had written. There were journals, there were letters. And then the Department of Defense in the 80s gathered together the nurses that were left and able to travel, and did personal interviews with them. And those interviews are on audio and transcribed. So that was an amazing source of, firsthand knowledge, the firsthand story of what happened. And that's what you want as a writer, is to have
Yeah.
those firsthand accounts.
So there are archives that people could go look at and listen to the stories and do the recordings. That it's amazing. I did some research once, a little bit on a Julius Lester, and I found out that he wrote a book about slavery, and he tapped into a whole bunch of archives that during the Depression, they were going around and interviewing people who had been slaves, right? And those archives exist from quite a few states, Georgia primarily, I think. But a lot of people didn't know those existed. And when Julius Lester was writing a book about slavery for adolescents, he found all those, right? And started mining those as a way of talking about, oh, we have some firsthand accounts of people who were slaves that had, still around during the Depression in the late 20s and early 30s, that somebody was smart enough to record, right? An archive. Yeah, I think that's great. So you're also a beneficiary of the government doing a little bit of that social archiving, right? That's
Yes,
fascinating.
a little bit late, but at least they
Yeah.
did it. 40 years later, but
Yeah, it's great. So you've done you did the whole range with Pure Grit, the personal connections, the stories, the letters, the archives that the government finally put together. How long did it take you to sort all that information and put it in this book in a concise way for adolescents? I'm amazed that you were able to do that.
well, I I didn't do it in a very organized way. Since it was my first book, I wasn't really sure what I was doing. But what helped me tremendously was, when you write a nonfiction book and you want to get it published, you start with a proposal. And in
Yeah.
that proposal, of course, you outline the book. And so I had to do a lot of thinking about it, and organizing the ideas in my mind before I started writing. And so I had also just underlined things. And I mean, I had a mass, I think I sent my editor stack this high of photographs I wanted in the book. And I thought, this is my first book. I thought, okay, he's going to tell me which photographs he wants. And he said, Mary, no. And it was the same with the book. When I first sent it in, it was way too long. And I thought he was going to tell me what to cut out because I thought it was all fascinating.
Yeah.
And he said, Mary, cut 20,000 words.
Yeah.
And he didn't tell me anything about how to cut it. So it was really learning. It was really learning as I went.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's a remarkable job that you've done for a first book. So I think that's great. So you went from there, and was the Fanny book the next book? Fanny Never Flinched. Was that the second one you did? So where
Right.
did
That
you
was,
go from there? Then you went
well, then actually my editor wanted me to do another book along the lines of Pure Grit. And I kind of, I had, while I was researching Pure Grit, I had stumbled across this 6 888 all black, all female battalion in World War II. And so I mentioned that to him, and he was like, yes, yes, write that book. So that was kind of how that one happened. Again, I looked for firsthand accounts. The other thing I like to mention is newspaper articles, for me, are a huge source. And it's kind of the same thing as we do today, is looking at who wrote the article, why they wrote
yes.
it, that kind of thing. But you I gained a lot from newspaper articles for all of the books I have written. So
Yeah, that's good. So you did the one on, and that's called Standing Up Against Tate. And how big was this battalion? How many people did it include? What was their main role?
well, there were 880 of them, and throughout the war, well, let me say first, a a part of the book is to showcase the fact that due to Eleanor Roosevelt, who we were talking about earlier, and Black leaders, Black women leaders, when the Women's Army Corps was formed, Black women were invited and allowed, even though this was a segregated army, they were able to train to be officers, and of course they were able to enlist. And so despite the fact that they were separated from the white women, they had the opportunity to take advantage of all the they were sorry.
Yeah.
So this was a great opportunity for Black women, and many signed up with high hopes, and many of them were extremely successful, especially Major Charity Adams, who led the battalion, the 6 888 battalion. But for a while, the Black women were kind of sitting around with nothing to do because some of the army forts didn't want them. Some of the army forts didn't have room for them to be segregated from the whites. And so, and all along this time, none of them were being sent overseas. And so then in 1944, the opportunity arose. The Army brass decided to send this battalion of Black women to England, where there was a huge backlog of mail. All the mail that was supposed to be going to the soldiers and any American people on the continent of Europe was in huge airplane hangars in Birmingham, England. And they needed they didn't have the manpower. The normal army men who did that sort of thing
Yeah.
were in were promoted to fighting or whatever. So they thought these women could go over and do that. So that's what happened. 880 Black women were trained and specifically for this job. They got on ships, sailed across to England, and attacked this huge backlog of mail. And they were supposed to finish in 6 months. They finished in 3 months. They did a tremendous job working 3 shifts around 8-hour shifts around the clock. And when you think about the mail system, which is not what young people today don't really use, and back
Yes.
then it was all we had.
Right.
They had the addresses of every soldier in Europe on note cards, and they had to go to the note card. Well, the army, whenever a soldier moved, they updated his note card. And
Yeah.
so these letters had been sent to wherever the soldiers were, and they weren't there anymore, and they'd been stockpiled. And now they took every single letter and package by hand and looked at that note card and resent it where it was supposed to be. So it's really incredible when I
Well,
think.
it's another story of the behind the scenes work. We still, many people know the image of Rosie the Riveter, but very few people know how much work that involved, and the kind of work that did, and how many of how many of the things that we built during the war were built by women and maintained by women, and then how quickly after the war we kind of dismissed these people, right? It's in some ways
Right.
we don't want to tell these stories, because if you ask, well, what did you do after that? You have all this expertise. Well, it reminds me a little bit of the Enigma girls. Their story was not told for a long time either, right? So you have this, and we've got Candace Fleming, who has a new book out on the Enigma girls, and she does something very similar to what you're doing by isolating 10 of those and trying to tell the story. But again, no one was really interested in their expertise after the war, right?
No, no.
You figure out some other way to use it. Well, that's so you've only been publishing now for am I right in saying about 10-11 years? Is that correct?
With this nonfiction, yeah, Pure Grit came out in 2010.
2010. Okay, so it's a decade and a half, 15 years. Then that's
Oh, wait,
really good.
did it? I don't know if it was 2010.
Did
No,
it
it was
feel like
2014.
2014? So it is closer to a decade then that you've been doing this. See, you're working too hard. You can't keep everything sorted either. That's different. So when Suzanne told me about you and I started looking, and I saw your newest book, Close Up on War, and I tell people, now I'm an old guy, I'm supposed to be retired. I still do a little bit of work with the blog and young adult literature, but I grew up in the Vietnam era. So when I saw that you had a book, Close Up on War, and tell me, how do we think we pronounce her name?
Catherine Leroy. That's
Catherine
she was
Leroy,
French.
because she's French, and I can remember watching Walter Cronkite as a kid, and seeing images on TV of soldiers in combat. But when I found out this Catherine Leroy was 21 and simply precociously decided that she wanted to be a war correspondent. I mean, this is the stuff that we make movies about, right? That we just make
Right.
up. And she, if I'm remembering correctly, with a new camera that she doesn't know how to use very well, and $200, she flies to Vietnam and starts saying, "Hey, I can take pictures." And what a fascinating story. So how did you come? And she ends up being very famous, right, in the
Right.
journalistic world and photography and all that business. But how did you land on that as a project? I'd like to hear about that.
Uh, I write a blog. It used to be a blog. Now it's a newsletter, every week where I feature historical women and sometimes just events and some men too. I can't write books about all these amazing people, so I kind of am always finding when I'm on the internet, I'm always
Yeah.
finding women and kind of keeping a file of them. And uh, she had been in my file for a while. I don't, and
Mm,
when I finally thought, okay, I'm going to write about her this week, and I started searching and finding everything I could about her, I thought, oh my gosh, this has to be a book. But as I thought about it, I thought, okay, well, we'll have her photographs. And I know there's reams of information I could talk about the Vietnam War, but that wouldn't really be a story. And so I kind of was deciding I couldn't do a book on her. And then
oh,
I discovered that she had written letters. Again, we come to that being the way to communicate with people at the time. She had written letters regularly to her parents, and her mother had saved them, thank God. And so when I started looking at these letters, I I realized that I could be right there. I could know her thoughts and her feelings and her experiences on the ground from
yeah.
these letters. And so that's when I decided that I wanted to do the book. And so I ended up, of course, doing a lot of research as well as the letters. One of the little, I guess you could say, bolts of dopamine or adrenaline I got when I was researching was when I could find a description of a battle that matched up to a letter that Catherine had written. She also, as well as that, she had a sort of manuscript she had written that kind of also dovetailed with the letters. I think, well, she did in fact plan to do a documentary when she
Yeah.
left Vietnam. And so uh, that document provided details of where she was on this day and who she talked to on that day and this kind of thing. So when I was able to actually match up an historical account of a battle with her little her little writings about what had happened to her there,
Yeah.
it, it was it was just incredible to be able to place her um, in the war like that, in the midst of everything going on.
Well, and that's for people who don't know the book. One of the things that's fascinating about it is each chapter, like you say, tends to start with the title, and then on the opposing face, people won't see this well, is I'm assuming a facsimile of the letter,
It's
or
actually, it's actually, and
a
this was,
restylization of it, or
yes,
because she
right,
was writing in French, I'm assuming, to her
right,
mother, right?
exactly,
So
exactly.
it's kind of a redoing of a facsimile of what would have been French to her mother, but English, where you imitate the typesetting and everything else, like it was probably on a typewriter or handwritten in different ways. But I love that. That's a really great technique of having the snippet of the letter, the title, and then you go into the chapter. And this, we can say, well, this looks like a fat young adult book. It's really parsed in such a way that it's the chapters are really short and manageable. They're really focused on a specific event that she's involved with or going to be involved with. And my I mean, I inhaled it in like probably less than a day and read the whole thing because it just it's not difficult to read, but it's also very engaging. So that if you sit down and take it, you're well into the book before you realize that you're into the book. You know.
Great. I'm so glad to hear that.
So it's a, like I say, I mentioned, you should tell your editor this book needs to go to every award, the National Book Award. It needs to go to state awards, because sometimes the nonfiction books have a hard time getting traction, but they need to be made. People need to be made aware of them, and hopefully this conversation and some promotion with this will be a little bit of a leg up on that avenue. But um, I can think of M.T. Anderson's had a couple of books that are historical that have been mentioned, and Steve Shankin's have some
Mhm.
that have got good play, but not enough. We can go back over the list of young adult awards, and the number of books that are focused on on nonfiction are not represented equally, in my opinion. Right? My little humble opinion about it all. So what else should we know about this woman? What are some of the things that really struck you as just monumental about somebody doing um, a Herculean task, so to speak, during the war?
Right. I don't even know where to start. I I I know that it's not necessarily best to comment on a woman's appearance, but if I think it's an important aspect of Katrine, because I like to I like to connect the fact that when she flew to Vietnam, women's rights in the United States was barely a whisper.
Yeah.
The the women that year is when I can't think of the name of the women's organization. I'm
Oh
sorry.
yeah. Well, it's
Now,
yeah
national.
now yeah
So at the time when Katrine flew to Vietnam, it was a couple months later that four women gathered in the United States to found the National Organization of Women.
yeah
So women's rights was barely a whisper. And yet here is this young woman flying and landing in the most masculine thing, war, doing the most masculine job beyond a soldier. I mean, first you're a soldier, the next thing is you're a war correspondent.
yeah
And she was barely 5 feet tall. And when she appeared at the Associated Press office asking to get credentials and to figure out how she was going to start being a war photographer, she had two blonde pigtails.
yeah
And she admits, she said, I look like a child. And at first, she was kind of the darling of
yeah
of the media there, of the other reporters and the other, or excuse me, the other photographers. And then she started coming up with these pictures that were basically better than theirs. And that's when the trouble started for her.
yeah. It's almost like initially I don't think they saw her as any potential threat to what they were doing, right? But I think one of the things that I loved about the story is before she ever goes there, she dates some guy who's into skydiving, and she learns to parachute. So she's already had quite a number of jumps before she ever goes to Vietnam. And then one of the strands, it's not ruining anything in the book. One of the strands that runs through the book is her getting involved with the very first combat parachute jump in Vietnam, and getting Westmoreland and others to sign off on her accompanying this attack, and parachuting out of the planes with this whole group. And you know, that tells you everything about her precocious nature. You know, oh, I can do this, and here's my certification. I'm certified to jump out of these planes. And so what if you have to weigh me down a little bit so the parachute doesn't float away, right? You know, because she weighs, you know, what, something like 90 pounds soaking
Right,
wet, right?
right.
And you think, oh, and we know that there were young boys that were small and all that stuff, but I think there was a height limitation in Vietnam. I think you had to be 5'5" or 5'6" to be in the military. So even among the smallest of soldiers, she's tiny,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well,
And
I,
along those lines, what another thing that really defines her is that she wanted to be where the action was. She wanted to be in the thick of it. And when she got there, she was calm and she was cool. It wasn't that she wasn't afraid. She was afraid, but she was able to do her job anyway. And it turns out in the end that she saw more time in combat than any news photographer that was there. And the correspondents often spent even less time because they weren't in the middle of the battle. They went and talked to the public affairs officer who was going to give them the details or whatever. So Katrine, she really was in the thick of the battle. She went with the Marines. She went with the cavalry soldiers. She was in the rice paddies. She was in the jungle. She was on the hilltops that had been decimated with chemicals. And she, I don't know what to say about her except that
well,
she,
it's
she,
stunning to do that. You know, it's stunning to watch it. And one of the photographs in the book, you point out that Dan Rather's in the background as a young, fairly young correspondent who's on the rise, right? He's on the rise after the assassination of Kennedy when he covered it in Dallas, and everybody's watching him, and he becomes the heir apparent of Walter Cronkite, right? As we go, but you think she's equal in the field, if not more in the field, than these people who are picked as the next big deal, right? With Dan Rather and some of these others. But and she had the good fortune and misfortune of being involved in several major operations, you know. Um, so even in kind of ending her last hurrah is kind of with the Tet Offensive, right? And she's doing that after she's already been injured, right? Am I sequencing
um,
that?
I'm thinking, no, I'm thinking,
Okay.
I could be wrong, but I'm thinking she was injured and she came back
Yeah, she
and
injured, come
then,
back, and then the Tet Offensive, right?
right,
Yeah, so she's after she's sustained an injury, recovered from it, she comes back and then is involved again in another major conflict, right? In doing that, and um, again, really notable because she and another French correspondent are apprehended by the North Vietnamese Regular Army and are in their possession for a few hours and talk their way out of it, right? And take
right.
photographs and and return back to behind the U.S. lines with that. But and so, if I'm remembering correctly, she's the first photojournalist to get pictures of the North Vietnamese Regular Army in combat or in combat situation.
I do believe that's true. And another thing I want to say about her is she got amazing award-winning photos of US Marines and soldiers. And then she got those photographs of the North Vietnamese soldiers. She also has many, many photographs of civilians.
Yeah, of the refugees, people
Right.
being moved from one place to another, right? Yeah.
So she really was telling the whole story. She, I think I would say she would do anything to get a picture. And well, I mean, she would, she would endure, she would endure any conditions to get the picture. And she wanted to tell the whole story.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty clear from the evidence you do in this story. And we have to tell people and readers that this is really, to use the photographic term, a snapshot of her career. Because these 3 years that she's involved in covering Vietnam as a photojournalist are just the beginning of what becomes a gigantic career covering other conflicts throughout the world, which she, I think, also receives even equal, if not greater, notoriety in terms of awards and stuff. But again, as somebody of, somebody who's of that certain age, I was going through the book, and many of the photographs are reminiscent of things I thought. And I thought, I probably saw that very Life magazine as a kid, and looked through these photographs, and you'll if somebody is in my age, somebody who's in their 60s or even their late 50s or even older than that, they'll look at this book, and these will be the photographs of their memory, along with other photojournalists. But you'll look at them and say, oh, these are exactly the style and the composition and the remarkable number of somebody, I think, gave her the advice to get close, and the number of these that are close up photographs of people who are in desperate circumstances is pretty remarkable. That you have the presence of mind to take that picture, right, and to hold that thing. So lots of research again. There you go. You talk to the people who own the letters and hold the letters, and all that stuff is pretty remarkable. And she died fairly young, in her
Did.
60s, right?
She did.
Do they trace it's a cancer? Do they think that it was connected to um, napalm and the other things that she was wandering
Agent
around in?
Orange. There's
Yeah.
no evidence that I could find of that, but practically anyone I talked to about this book who was involved in any way with the war, there are very many sad. I mean, this book is tragic in many ways. I mean,
Yeah.
not the book, but Katrine's life was tragic in many ways. She had a extreme case of post-traumatic stress.
It's probably hard to talk about, and how could you not, right? Um, she had the ability that some people have to be in a crisis and be calm while she just probably had the presence to do that. But then when you're out of that crisis and or left alone or have downtime and have to think about it, the trauma of trying to deal with it must just be extraordinary. I had a good friend that I spent a couple of summers with who was he taught in Iowa, I taught in Utah, and we ended up at the same NEH seminars. But he was in Vietnam in the 60s at this time, in the 66 or 67, and so he was home before most of the protests. And he says, I just went to school and tried to forget. I didn't get involved in any of it. And then he said, then I made the mistake of watching one of the first PBS documentaries. And he says, and I saw this young 6'3" guy carrying a bandolier of ammunition and a machine gun on his shoulder. And he says, it wasn't any kid, it was me. He says, I was in the clip. And he says, and I went. He says, that next day, he said, I went to therapy because things I hadn't thought about,
Right.
went up there. And he was very early when they were embedded with South Vietnamese regular army and functioning as advisors. He was in that group where they weren't really in, a lot of his time was not as a platoon or a company wandering around as U.S. soldiers. They were still fairly embedded
Yeah,
early on.
and that I think Katrine ended up arriving there right when the US was escalating, right when the numbers of Marines were multiplying and
Yeah.
the fighting was really beginning. One thing she said about coming home was she would have nightmares that she was covered in blood and
Yeah.
things like that. Um,
Well,
and
it's my friend Randy talks about it. He said, he says it was a few years before he could talk about it, um, but he said it was good to get therapy. He says, I realized I wasn't the only one that came home and didn't think it, tried not to think about it. And he says it was fairly radically different when he came home because they weren't being pointed at, they weren't being accused early. So he was able to just kind of fly under the radar and, was had a successful teaching career for before he was kind of forced to think about it. So I wonder because she didn't just come home then; she came home and covered riots in Harlem after the assassination of Martin Luther King. She goes to I think, doesn't she end up in Liberia for a while, or
uh-huh.
she or Libya, or she ends up
Yeah,
in
she was even in Ireland during.
yeah during the some of those things. So it's a fascinating story that I hope people would take the time to read, and and you can link to this conversation where we talk about it on your blog and other things. So what's next on the horizon? Have you got another project you're thinking about, or
Well, I do have another nonfiction project that I'm thinking about, but I'm not really talking about it yet.
okay, so
Um,
there's something on the horizon but not
yeah,
coming out.
yeah. It's amazing. It's a woman I can't believe I haven't heard of. Um,
Yeah.
but I'm also writing fiction now.
Okay, good.
That was what I wanted to do in the beginning, and I'm just going to take a stab at it. I'm hoping I can do both. That's my goal.
Good. Well, some of you are brighter than I am, and people I know. You can do both of those things. What I hope to do is that you need to call your publisher and say, sponsor me to go to NCTE or to Allen. I don't know. Have you ever been to either one of those, to NCTE conference
I
or?
I went to NCTE with Peer Grit.
Okay. Did they get you involved in the Allen workshop after NCTE? Have you done that?
No, no, I
Okay,
haven't.
well, we need to we
I
need to
would
write
love
some
to.
yeah, we need to write some emails back and forth because the Monday and Tuesday after NCTE focus on a conference, a workshop that is the teaching of young adult literature. So publishers bring in a lot of um, authors to do that, and certainly I can connect you with people who run that program and run that organization, and your publishers should know about it. But it's also a hard game. There's a lot of negotiation about who gets to go and what their goals are as publishers, and the people who are running the particular arm of Allen. It's called the Assembly for Literature for Adolescents of the National Council of Teachers of English. So um, but I can send you some information about that as well, so
Thank you.
it can do that. But
Thank you.
I'd love to see you there, because certainly there are from time to time people there talking about nonfiction, right? And
Right.
there's usually a strand of people talking about nonfiction books. Let me ask you one more thing, because teachers always want to know this, and because they like to tell kids that this isn't magic. This is kind of hard work. So when you're writing, what's your process? Do you do it every day? What kind of approach do you take to getting something written?
Well, I do write every day, but I will say it took me 10 or 15 years to get the habit. It it's not easy. It is not easy. Um, I think every author will say that. Doesn't matter if it's your first book or your 10th book or whatever. It's never easy. It's hard work. And I I don't know what to say about my process except that I immerse myself in the nonfiction. I immerse myself in the research. until, and I begin to feel like I'm in that world instead of the world I'm actually in. And then I'm always thinking about the reader and what will pull them in to the story. And these women that I've written about, every single one of them has a different, well, what I've focused on kind of with these women is what courage looks like. And throughout my books, especially in Standing Up Against Hate, the Black women come up against a lot of racism, and they cope with it in one way or another. And to me, it was interesting. A couple, I mean, some of the women, when they faced the dirty jobs they were given, scrubbing walls and floors, which were not jobs for women's Army Corps, some of them resigned. Some of them just focused on what they hoped to gain in the long run and put their head down and did the job. And some of them outright rebelled. 4 of them went on strike, which you don't do in the military. That's called insubordination.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that there's no one way to be courageous.
Yeah.
That I've learned a lot from these women about being courageous in your own place, in your own time, and in your own circumstances. So it's very personal to me. I guess I'm coming back around to the process. I feel like I can't write about it until I can immerse myself into it, at least try to understand what it was like for these women.
Yeah. So the immersion process is important. So the research and gathering and collecting all that stuff. And then once you have it, you're content if you sit at the desk and write something every day? That's the process. Are some days longer than others?
Yes. Some days are really long and there's very little written.
Yeah.
But with nonfiction, I can focus and write for many hours a day.
Yeah.
It's to me, it's the task is very clear. When like I said about the proposal, the thing about writing a nonfiction book is what I try to come up with in the beginning is a concept that will hook young readers, and then lay out the outline. And so once I've got that done, it's just like sit there and get it done kind of
Something
thing.
to do. And that comes from your experience as a journalist and doing that kind of work as well. That helps you. Well, it's been fascinating to talk with you and fascinating to get to know your books. And I think what a gem of a story, about close up on war, about the Vietnam with Katrine. It's a fascinating story, and I hope it gets some praise and gets more traction than nonfiction usually gets. So thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm so excited that you're so excited about Katrine's story, because I would like to see more people reading it.
So
Thank you so much for your interest. I'm really grateful.
no, and I'll be in touch when we go and be in touch with some of the other stuff. But this has been a fascinating opportunity.